welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is a podcast about printing and feminism. On this episode, I am joined by Maryam Fanni and Sara Kaaman, who are two-thirds of the design collective MMS, along with Matilda Flodmark. Collaborating since 2012, MMS focuses on investigations and writings about visual culture, graphic design, and historiography from a feminist perspective. They recently published, with occasional papers, a new book called Natural Enemies of Books, A Messy History of Women in Printing and Typography. The edited anthology looks at the relationships between feminism and printing, graphic design, and labor. The book, like all of their collaborations, seeks to expand and perhaps problematize the histories of graphic design and printing. I loved this book. It's exactly the kind of design history book that I like and want to see more of. And I felt like I was discovering another side of the field that I was, frankly embarrassed to know little about. So that's where we start this conversation. We talk about the book and the origins of the project. We talk about the parallels between women in labor and printing from history and how that relates to today, and why we need to move towards a more messy history of graphic design. This all leads to questions around expanding the nature of design, of course, and the value of collaborations. Remember, Scratching the Surface is made possible because of listeners like you. If you enjoy the show and want to help support it, you can become a member for just $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter that is written by me, as well as previews of the upcoming episodes. If you like Scratching the Surface and want to see it continue, please consider becoming a supporting member. It truly means so much to me. For all the details, you can visit scratchingthesurface.fm/members. Thank you for listening, and here is my conversation with MMS's Maryam Fanni and Sara Kaaman. Your book, this new book that just came out, Natural Enemies of Books, is kind of loosely framed around or based upon or in dialogue with this older book that you found, the Distaff Side. And I'm curious kind of how you encountered that book, and if you could kind of talk about what that book means to you and how that kind of prompted the book that you ended up producing.
Yeah. I think we need to bring Matilda into the conversation then, who was not able to be here. But she found the book on an online exhibition catalog for an exhibition at Princeton, I think. The exhibition was called Unseen Hands, and it was a survey of women working in printing and typography. A historical survey. And then that book was mentioned in the exhibition catalog.
Well, she decided she wanted to do some more research on this book and applied for a travel grant to travel to the U.S. And I believe Princeton University Library then to have the opportunity to read the book through it, and she was awarded the grant and then decided to buy a copy instead, because she suddenly found a copy at a rare bookshop online. So that's the story of how this one copy of this 100 edition book came to Stockholm. Yeah.
Can you just for listeners, can you describe and talk about what that book was and kind of why it became the framework for the book that you then created?
Yeah. I mean, when Matilda bought it, she didn't really know what she was buying. She had seen a table of content and some short things about it on this other website. But when she got it, she realized it's like a treasure. It was printed or published in 1937, and the full title is Bookmaking on the Distaff Side. which means bookmaking on the female side. And the book is it's like a collage or a kind of well, it's an anthology with different contributions from women at that time working in printing and typography, or researching women in printing and typography. And it's a very crafty book, or sort of crafted. It's like a beautiful object. It's hand bound, obviously, and all the different signatures are printed on different paper and designed by different people. So the object itself is very like tactile and beautiful. And then the content is really interesting, or we found it
Right.
super interesting, because it's like so many different voices from women at that time. And I think or I don't know if I can speak for all of us, but our experience of learning about the history of printing and typography from like the 1920s, 30s, 40s has been lacking a lot
Right.
of female voices, or voices other than men. So that was, yeah, like we needed to do something with it somehow.
I mean, I guess that's kind of what's interesting to me about that book and how your book then is in dialogue with that book, because something that you say at the beginning of Natural Enemies of Books is that you thought, perhaps we almost do I'm sorry, I forget kind of your exact phrasing, but almost like a second edition or a new edition of that with people working today, women working today, and that somehow felt limiting in a way that so much of design or typography history is already limiting. Can you talk a little bit about the process of putting together Natural Enemies of Books and kind of your goals for that, and talking about the role of women in printing and typography and design today?
Sure. A book like this it could be done in so many different ways. Obviously, we one of our departure points has been the concept of messy history, coined by the design historian Martha Scotford,
Right.
where she suggests that messy history is um, a concept that can be understood um, contrasting to neat history, which is
Right.
kind of conventional history writing that follows the mechanisms of capitalist and patriarchal structures. And the messiness about messy history is that it suggests a less linear idea of history and history writing, and acknowledges a lot of voices and experiences that take place outside of what is normally being included in history books, history writing. Departing from that idea, which is also um, one of our key concepts, let's say, in our collaboration, our curiosity about um, experiences that are not maybe considered even to be classified as or categorized as design or included in design history. Uh, so that's kind of the foundational idea of how we came to design the book in this way and edit it like this, rather than, for example, um, asking for contributions by
Right.
contemporary design practices. I mean, that would have been interesting as well, but we were particularly interested in uh, taking further uh, the, the content of this original book, Bookmaking on this side, from the 1937, and histories about women in printing that is
Right.
discussed there, and to kind of make a contemporary contribution that takes this that discussion further and explores what has happened since that book was published, and what is there now to say about the uh, the 20th century experiences of women printing together, and the potential for that.
Yeah, it's interesting to me, and it was interesting to me when I was reading the book because th- your book seems kind of simultaneously a book that is looking at the history of women in printing and typography, and especially the history around bookmaking on the distaff side. But it's also a book that is very much about the kind of contemporary condition and the contemporary condition of women in design and typography today. And I'm wondering if in the research of this book, do you have a sense on if and how the role of women in typography has changed in since 1937?
Wow.
You know what I mean? Like it felt so like even reading about the history, it still felt very like, oh, have we gotten any better? You know what I
Mm,
mean?
mm,
Like let me phrase the question a different way, because I'm also very interested in Scofford's idea of messy history, and I still feel like we teach and talk about design history in the mode of neat history,
mm,
and all of this other stuff is still considered alternative, different, messy, um, outside of the mainstream. And I guess what I'm wondering is, how do we I'm not asking you to solve this question, but I'm really asking if you have thoughts on this. Is it possible to get to a point where this is not considered alternative design history? And I guess this is a long way to kind of get to this question, but what struck me reading the book is how many of the figures that you reference were unknown to me, and they should not have been unknown to me. You know what I
mm,
mean?
mm,
And so how do we move beyond, or is it even possible to move beyond, or have we moved beyond this idea of thinking of certain types of designers or certain types of design practices as alternative or
mm,
outside, I guess.
mm.
Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting um, dilemma, or it's an interesting question that is sort of underlying maybe the book,
Mm-hmm.
or like a sort of yeah, like something running through. And I think there are a lot of things happening at the moment right now in rewriting history, design
Mm-hmm.
history, or expanding or exploding the design history canon,
Mm-hmm.
um, in ways that are um, like not sort of repeating this format of the one person
Right.
success
Right.
story, which excludes so many practices in design and typography. Like it's not possible to write a history that is just like zooming in or spotlighting single names, or it becomes a very, very, very limited history. Um, so I think, yeah, I don't know if that was an answer to your question, but I think it's possible, and I think it's happening um, right now in different people doing research and like writing other histories.
Yeah, and it's also about, like, not necessarily. I think it's not about only, so to say, adding to the current structure of design history writing by adding individual success stories or successful designers, but it's rather about renegotiating what can be considered design and what kind of practices
Mm.
and activities that can be introduced to yeah, what design can be. So not
Yeah.
necessarily that we need to. I mean, even maybe even the concept design can be renegotiated, so to say.
Yeah. And I think another thing that we're sort of secretly trying to do with the book, or maybe not so secret, is bringing in the question of working conditions
Yeah.
and talking about working conditions of the past and how they have sort of shifted and morphed and changed through history, through the machines that we're working with
Hmm.
that have changed. And I think that would be an interesting, or I think that's an important sort of lens to look at history through, and also looking at the present.
Yeah, it's interesting to me too, because as I was reading your book, I was also reading the new book by Danielle Aubert on the Detroit Printing Co-op.
Hmm.
Um, I'm going to be interviewing her soon, also, and both of your books were similar in the sense that it was looking at the history of printing and the history of typography, and sure, we can use the word design also here, uh, as a lens to talk about, yes, the kind of formal qualities of these things and what the kind of printing or the typographic languages did, but primarily looking at these ideas as a lens to talk about feminism, to talk about the history of labor, to talk about unions. How did you kind of think about that lens, both in the process of this book, but also thinking about your own practices? Kind of putting your practices into this lineage. How do these kind of ideas of unions, of labor, of feminism, of kind of this ideas of reproduction? Did this change how you kind of thought about your own work today?
What's sort of important to know about bookmaking on the distaff side is that it's a book that comes from sort of fine printing tradition, so it's like a
Mm,
very exclusive object, and
hmm.
it doesn't to well, it does contain histories of working conditions and labor, but when we researched further and brought in the interviews with Megan and Gail in London, that was a way um, to bring in working conditions that are maybe closer to the present and
Mm,
closer to a sort of um, labor history, design history that is not so exclusive, perhaps, or not so um, expensive. I don't know.
mhm,
Um, so I think that was, yeah, I think, I don't know, I lost my thread. Maryam, do you want to add anything
Yeah,
on this?
I I I, I think it's relevant what you're saying because uh, in a way, I mean, bookmaking on the desktop side was only printed in 100 copies, and in a way, one could say that it wasn't supposed for wide distribution, but it was rather a contribution to uh, book like printing history within a certain audience, perhaps, and I guess our attempt is rather, or has been throughout our collaboration, we have been driven by popularizing this kind of feminist and workers' history approach to design. So I don't know if that was what you were going for, Sarah, as well. But
Yeah.
I mean, we have been doing previous to editing this book. We've also been arranging study groups and lectures at the Workers' Education Association here in Stockholm, for instance, and in various ways trying to kind of provoke discussions about design in relation to labor and women's history in arenas beyond academia. So that's kind of one of our central interests.
I just wanted to say that I think what we find when we bring these discussions or these angles to the table is that a lot of people are really sort of desiring to talk about what does it mean to freelance and what does it mean to work on your own, and both sort of psychologically and emotionally, but also about the actual the way your body is affected by working on your laptop in a sort of hunched over everything that you're taking for granted, sort of, and is an everyday, and but to discuss it together and look at it through the lens of history.
Yeah, and it's interesting, and you kind of saw where I was going with this question, actually, because I wanted to start to put this book into the context of your larger work and of the collaboration that the two of you, along with Matilda, have been doing since 2012. You collaborate under the name MMS, and on your website you describe this collaboration as investigations and writings on visual culture, graphic design, and the historiography from feminist perspectives. And I would love to hear more about the origins of this collaboration and the goals for these various projects, because like you said, they do take the form of various things. There's this book, you've curated shows, you do reading groups, you've kind of edited other collections. How do you kind of see this collaboration? What do you hope kind of comes out of it?
We were asked this question in a email interview the other day, and I was thinking of I mean, looking back, it's only 8 years ago, but I think the time around 2010 was in the years around that time was a formative period for many people, perhaps. And I was asking myself, like, how come we formed as a group in that moment? And I think um, in that period of time, well, obviously the financial crisis was in 2008, and then we experienced a lot of privatizations and cuts in education. And in 2011, we saw introduction of tuition fees for international students here in Sweden. And Matilda and I met through those protests against the introduction of tuition fees. And I remember there were also large meetings arranged for feminists within art and design, which I think led to different initiatives departing from those big meetings. But I guess, like, looking back, I can see that there was this kind of a period of time that where people formed groups in ways. And I think I don't know if this resonates with you, Sara, but I think at least for me, this kind of new political landscape, also in 2010, the far right nationalist party in Sweden entered the parliament. So there was this kind of new political landscape that was formative for myself and people around me.
Mm.
And I think as a design student, we all had a need to, or I did at least, the need to kind of to be part of a kind of what do you say, a commitment where you kind of promise each other that we will investigate things together
Right.
more long term, not only this week or this month, but in a more a longer perspective. And yeah, so that's kind of how I think about how we formed at least.
Yeah, me and Matilda studied in the same class, and then Maryam and Matilda also met in school, and I think we shared this sort of desire to go beyond the individualist narrative and or strategy that we had sort of learned in school, and or keep learning. So in a way, I think I remember it as a kind of support group in its first stages, of just a group where with people you trust, where you can vent about
Right. Yeah. I have two thoughts. One, this is just something that I realized thinking about this idea of kind of like the individual, and as we were talking earlier about kind of talking about design history as a history of individuals and the problems with that, in that all of my emails with you to schedule this have come from the same email address. I wasn't emailing all three of you, and that I assume sometimes a different person would be responding to me, but it wasn't always signed who it was from. It was just from all of you collectively, which is actually a really interesting gesture. Is that intentional?
We've had some strategies. For a long time, we didn't. We always refused being photographed, for example, like portrayed, and things like that. So I think we've been experimenting with different strategies of refusing being
Right.
individualized in various ways, and yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's not very successful to to sign an email like that, but I guess it is intentional to some extent.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, it's interesting. I like it a lot. I never knew how to like address the emails, like who I was actually writing to, but I think I like it. The other question that I had in what you were talking about is this idea of these projects or these investigations were thinking about the long view in addition to the right now. And that's something that really resonates with me. And it's something that I really appreciated when I was thinking about your work and in this book and even your other projects, in that this work took a variety of forms. Like you said, sometimes this was shows, sometimes this was a book, sometimes this is kind of an edited collection of essays, sometimes this is a reading list. And I think many times the graphic designer's impulse is to respond. This is a blanket statement, and I'm generalizing here. Um, but I've been thinking about this a lot, especially kind of as we're in the midst of a pandemic and kind of sheltering in place, that the designer's kind of initial impulse often is kind of the quick response. Um, it's like, oh, let's design some posters to raise awareness about this. And that has always felt very short-sighted to me. And that if the let me think how to say this. Is the best that the designer can do is just kind of like designing the poster that raises awareness. Um, and I'm interested in how, if either of you have any thoughts on that, but then also if these kind of other initiatives, whether that is the book or the reading list, do you consider these design responses in the same way that, like, you know, uh, designing like a poster or something? Do you see those as analogous in any way? I mean, and I'm phrasing that in a weird way. I mean, the better question is probably like, do you consider, or does it matter? Are these works of design? Is this design what you're doing still? As we were talking about earlier, of kind of expanding or changing the definitions of design, do you consider the work of MMS um, design work or design projects?
Oh, interesting question. I haven't thought about it that way actually, because I guess it's because I haven't I'm not so much involved in that kind of use of the word design, because in
Mm,
certain fields, like I'm thinking of participatory design or
mm, mhm.
experience design, and this kind of fields, it's more natural, I guess, to
Right. Yeah,
use
that's true.
that the word design or designing to describe actions, or like a chain of activities,
Hmm. Hmm.
this kind of stuff. But I consider myself a graphic designer, and maybe I'm a graphic designer in a traditional sense. I design printed matter, and in our group we have rather um, decided that we don't do commission design
Mm,
work, and kind of separate that from uh, the more like reading and writing and arranging lectures and this kind of
mhm.
knowledge production practice. Not saying that it is not about designing situations, because obviously it is.
Right. Right.
Mm.
But we haven't actively described our collaborative practice as designing situations or designing. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Mm.
No, I think it's an interesting question that I also haven't thought about in that way. And I'm thinking that we are graphic designers that are doing these things, that are sort of including these practices into the practice of what you can do as a graphic designer. But that doesn't make these reading groups or investigations works of graphic design, if that makes sense.
Right. Right. I mean, that does make sense, and that was not a question that I was kind of planning on asking you ahead of time. This is something I've been thinking about,
Mm.
kind of independently of thinking about talking to both of you about this word design and the value, or if there is a value in holding on to that word. What does that word design mean today? And as we've been talking, it's been interesting, especially talking about bookmaking on the distaff side, and ideas of messy history, that in these contexts, that word design almost feels limiting. And it does exclude a lot of practices and a lot of people um, who we probably could call designers, or at least could serve as models to look to today. Um, and so I've been thinking a lot about this idea of, these boundaries of design, and where it ends, if it does end, or if it is even kind of useful. And I think the way that you articulated that is, um, for yourselves, is interesting. And you both have practices outside of this collaboration that, if I'm understanding correctly, you're kind of describing as quote unquote more traditional graphic design, designing printed matter, etc. Does do these collaborations, does organizing lectures, putting together this book, how does that research and thinking influence how you think about that other graphic design work, if it does at all?
I think it's difficult to locate where exactly those experiences are, like this kind of let's say interest in social dimensions of thinking and the production of knowledge, how that to locate where that in what ways and how it influences the designing practice. But I'm convinced it does. And for my part, for example, I mean, I've been involved in many different collaborations, working where I'm not necessarily where I don't have a conventional designer role, so to say, where I'm not like responding to a brief, but I'm
Right.
more of an editor, let's say, or an artist or whatever, in a situation, thinking about and developing and articulating whatever project it is, equally as much as the other participants coming from other fields. And I know Sara works in this way in some collaborations as well. So maybe that then that this kind of engagement or interest also opens up possibilities of renegotiating the designer role for oneself. I read on your website, Jarrett, that you describe your podcast, or you sometimes describe your podcast that it's a podcast about designers who designers.
Yeah.
And I have to just mention another quote, because the book that we have been investigating, bookmaking on the distive side, one of the one of the key persons who were arranging that project in the 30s was Jane Grabhorn, a printmaker and a printer in California. And so she's a person that we have been quite interested in knowing more about. So we read that she has apparently said that she always felt a little contemptuous of people who call themselves designers, who seem to think this is more artistic and do not want to be thought of as lowly laborers. End of quote. And I think that's also an example of a designer who don't want to call themselves designers.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing. But I do think that there's something to this kind of thread that we've been talking about this whole conversation about how we kind of think about history and contemporary practice and the limits and places where we can break those limits of the labels that we put on it. I don't know what to do with that, but I think it's something very interesting, which is why I describe this podcast as sometimes it's a podcast about designers who don't want to be designers, because at least for myself, so much of my work is kind of trying to find, well, is this still graphic design? What is this? Like, is this podcast graphic design? I don't know. Am I a graphic designer that does a podcast? Probably, but I don't know. It's I find these questions very interesting, as you can imagine.
We agree.
Yeah, and I think it's sort of I think graphic design as a profession, title graphic design, is also quite young. So I think it's I don't know, it's like from the 40s or something.
William Addison Dwiggins coined the term graphic design in 1923, I think.
23.
I've heard some historians dispute that and think that someone else actually had said it earlier, but I he's kind of the one that's credited with it.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe never mind. Maybe it doesn't matter where it's from, but maybe just to say that it's in flux
Right.
today. And I think like keeping it open and welcoming like other practices into it that hasn't been labeled graphic design before. There's just so much to win, I think, in that.
Yeah.
Because it becomes so much richer.
Right.
The practice or the field or the profession.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And I think that's what I appreciate about your work and your collaboration. It's what I also really appreciated about the book, and what I think, gets back to this idea of messy history. It's about, keeping all of this open. I'm interested. I have just a couple questions to kind of start to wrap up the conversation. I'm interested in how working on Natural Enemies of Books, doing this research, kind of thinking through this, spending time with bookmaking on the distaff side, and even thinking about these labels and the flux of this idea of graphic design. Did this change at all how you think about your work as a graphic designer, or how you think about yourself as a graphic designer, or the type of work that you want to do?
I think we have a lot of very interesting contributions in the book. For example, Jess Baines, who has been writing about uh, radical print shops and feminist printing collectives in the 70s and 80s in the UK. In her contribution, reading her contribution kind of helped me understand my own experiences of designing things collectively, and how formative that is, and what the qualities in that kind of activity um, uh, in that kind of activities are, and also the contribution by the Swedish poet Ida Börjel, which talks about the relationship between Gertrude Stein and Laura Riding. Initially, when we asked Ida to write a contribution for our book, we presented our our thoughts and ideas about this anthology, and asked if she could write something about Gertrude Stein, because we knew that she was familiar with her practice. And Gertrude Stein is also one of the contributors of the bookmaking on the distaff side. So we wanted to make that kind of link. And Ida ended up writing a beautiful contribution about the the friendship between these two, and how it kind of circulates around the printing press. So yeah, I guess from working with this book, I have it has let's say expanded my understanding of my own.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's great.
I think also coming back to Jane Grabhorn and her contribution to the bookmaking book that we reprinted in our book has been, to me, just really inspirational and supportive in typography, because it's a really satirical and funny take on typographic rules and how ridiculous they are, and how you should break them. And
yeah,
I think it's really I mean, that's something that I do anyway, I think, in typography, being kind of loose, playing loose, but reading her text from 37 is like an important supporter somehow.
Yeah, I love that. What's next for you. What are you thinking about now? How do you kind of continue this research, or where do you see it going forward?
Yeah, what was originally next was to do a book launch tour in Europe by train, and that has been postponed now, maybe into the fall.
Yeah, obviously because of the virus situation. So we haven't really launched the book as we had expected. But that's something that we really look forward to, actually present the book to an audience and see received face to face.
I think there's many things in our research that never made it into this book, into Natural User Books, and there's many threads that would be nice to follow somehow in the future. And also, I think we're working on maybe possibly reprinting the original book making on the Stuff Side book, but we're working on copyright issues.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I understand that. It's interesting to hear you say that there are all these threads that you could go further, because I kind of felt that. I took so many notes reading the book of, I want to research this person more or this idea more, because it would just be mentioned or kind of, drop there and then move on. And so I hope that you do kind of consider following through on some of those, because I think I agree with you. There's a lot to this. My last question, and this is a question that I use to end all of these conversations. I'm just interested to hear what you both are reading right now. Are you reading anything interesting?
I just started reading the doctoral dissertation of a scholar named Maryam who has been writing about skyscrapers and how they often are used for communicating imaginaries of a financial crisis, and I think that's really interesting. So she departs from examples in popular culture, films, and literature, and so on. Narrating the global financial crisis, urban imaginaries, and the politics of myth. This is what I'm reading at the moment.
Oh, that sounds so interesting.
I think it is, and especially at this moment when we, at least here in Stockholm, or Sweden, we see a lot of new skyscrapers and also perhaps a financial crisis at the moment. So it's kind of interesting to me to read this at the moment.
Yeah.
I'm reading a bunch of different things, but one thing is I'm trying to get through Hersey's magazine. It's a magazine that was published in the 70s and 80s from New York, and they have all their issues published online as PDFs, and they're it's like a feminist magazine on art and politics, and it was edited collectively, so every issue is very different in like tone and design and content. So yeah, I'm reading them through.
That's great. I love that. This was such a interesting conversation to me. I completely loved reading through the book and thinking about these things, and it was so nice to kind of talk through some of these ideas that I was kind of picking up from them and kind of hear how you were thinking about ideas in the book. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. I thought this was great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
This episode was recorded on May 7th, 2020. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.